I'm John Burn-Murdoch. I'm the chief data reporter and a columnist at the Financial Times, where, yeah, I make lots of charts. Some would say too many. And yeah, I'm going to be your host today. I'm going to be talking through in this session, like the broad principles really that guide what we do at the FT, why we do it, how we do it, all of that, and in terms of data visualization. Um, and yeah, just to reiterate what Louisa was saying there, love to, very happy to take questions as we go, as well as taking more at the end. And to emphasize that this is session one of three, so there will be plenty of stuff that I allude to, reference today, which is going to be delved into in more depth in next week's session. As I say, this one is really about the big principles, theories, evidence for what we should be doing when we make charts. Next week, there's going to be a lot more case studies, examples, walkthroughs of how to get from the starting point to the finishing point of a lot of the types of charts that we make. So yeah. Um, so I'm now going to open with a sort of existential question for any of us who are in the business of making charts, which is why do we bother? The amount of time I have spent making charts over the years, I wouldn't even I'd hate to think it's probably gone into the weeks in terms of actual hours, maybe even longer. Which means I think it's really important that we ask ourselves, why do we bother? What's the point? Is there something that charts do that other forms of communication, other media are unable or less able to do? Um, and as this is the first of many times that you're going to see a slide that looks a bit like this during today's session, which is let's look at the actual science on this. It's really interesting working in data visualization because there are a lot of guidelines, best practices, maxims, slogans out there, um, which I think are, well, that some of them are relatively weak on evidence. So I think it's really important that we look at science where possible, and this is going to be the first such example from today. So, why do we make charts? Well, fortunately, there was a paper done about 10 years ago by a couple of social scientists that tried to test this exact question. What is it about charts? Is there anything about charts that makes them more effective than other forms of communication? That paper had the snappy, catchy title of The Roles of Information Deficits and Identity Threat in the Prevalence of Misperceptions. And this is one British and one American social scientist who wanted to look at this. And the way they decided to test for this was to take controversial subjects, or controversial for the audiences that they tested them with, at least, and see how different approaches of communication, different media, different mediums, different formats affected the extent to which people's perceptions could be changed or specifically corrected, um, using, for example, a simple sentence of text, a more statistic heavy paragraph of text, or importantly for us, a chart. So, in one of the case studies that they used, one of the experiments that they used in this paper, they took the topic of belief in or acceptance of global warming and humans' role in global warming, and they tested this with a group of American conservatives, American Republicans. So you've got a group here for whom this was quite a divisive topic. And what the researchers wanted to find out was how does this group's how do this group's views change depending on whether we present the factual scientific information as text or as a chart? So for one group, they simply asked this question. They said, would you say that average global surface temperatures have gone up, stayed about the same, or gone down in the last 30 years? So this is your control group where there's nothing special about the way this is being communicated. It's a simple question to test sort of baseline global warming skepticism, I guess you could say. Then for a second group, they showed them this more statistic heavy paragraph of text explaining what's happened over the last 30 years, emphasizing that this is something where there is scientific consensus, where multiple different sources all show similar trends. Really, the kind of thing you might read in a scientific article or a news article saying, here are the facts that indeed the globe has got significantly warmer in the last few decades. And then, most interestingly for us, the third group was shown this real chart from a NASA paper, which shows the actual data on what's happened to global temperatures, global average temperatures over, well, more than several decades here. So you've got three different treatments, sort of no extra information, some statistics, and then a chart. And the key question is, do this naturally sort of global warming skeptic group respond differently? Do they change their minds or not change their minds differently depending on which format of information they received? So here's your control group, the group who was simply asked, do you believe global warming is happening? And about 40% of these US Republicans said they do not believe it's happening. So this is essentially our baseline. We've got a fairly climate skeptic group here. The second group that were then shown the paragraph full of texts and scientific information, you actually see very little difference. So even when someone receives written information telling them, here is what has happened, scientists agree, the data shows this, yada, 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 very little decrease in the amount of global warming skepticism there. So seeing that information didn't seem to change people's minds very much. Whereas the third group, who are shown a chart, you see this really significant drop off. So instead of almost half of people not believing that this is indeed happening, you've now got only 1 in 10 not believing that this is happening when shown this in chart form. And that was consistent throughout this study where they took different topics. They took things like claims and counterclaims that were being made about what was happening to unemployment during the Obama presidency, various different things. And a consistent finding was that when this information is presented in a chart, it is especially effective at persuading people whose starting position was to doubt the reality to then come around to accepting that this is indeed reality. So as they themselves concluded, providing information in graphical form reduces misperceptions. And I would almost extend that and say, regardless of whether we're talking about correcting misperceptions, providing data in chart form seems to be more persuasive, more effective than providing that exact same information in text. And we could go off at a whole tangent about why that is. I think for me, the short version is that when we are in school and we're taught about writing, we're not just taught to write and to read, we're taught to critique and think about what is the author trying to say, how are they going about that in the way they've written something. We're taught to be almost skeptical of the written word, whereas we generally encounter charts in the sort of results, conclusions, here's reality section. So all of that's a long-winded way of saying I'm not sure whether there's something innate in charts that makes them more trusted, more believed, but whatever the reason is, that is the reality. And so we have this amazingly powerful tool that when we make a chart, we're able to cut through people's pre-existing beliefs in a way that text struggles with. So yeah, to put that in a snappier language, why do we make charts? Because charts change minds. And I recall a conversation I once had with someone, a pretty prominent writer with an enormous audience, but they were saying that the thing that they were they were sort of almost annoyed with whenever they saw some of our work at the Financial Times was that charts are just that much more information dense. They convey information that much more snappily. So this was someone who writes amazing articles in a huge amount of depth, but they were annoyed that they weren't good at making charts because of that sort of advantage that charts have. So that is a long-winded way of me saying that for those of us who do make charts, that's good. It is worthwhile doing, and we should keep doing more of them. But there's now much bigger questions, such as what is it that makes a chart succeed? There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of charts being put out there into the world every week. And I think most people would agree they're of varying quality. So what is it that makes some charts really, really successful and others less so? Again, if you look at the literature out there, there are a lot of claims made about the perfect chart, what makes a chart better, what makes a chart worse. People talk about the need for charts to be really, really minimalist in their design. There's the famous data to ink ratio, this idea that there should be as much data as possible in there for as little ink as possible, which again, you'd end up with something incredibly minimalist, just stripping things back all the way. A lot of guidelines out there, and as I was saying earlier today, some of those are, I would say, more based in evidence than others. Um, so again, our approach at the FT is, we read all those books, but we also want to see more research, more experimental information on what actually is it that is going on when people are encountering charts. It's not just good enough to see to think, right, well, so and so says charts should do this. What actually happens when people test this in the wild? So time for our second bit of science. And this was a study done just 3 years ago, which makes it particularly useful. And the researchers this time around wanted to see how the different amounts of text in charts affect the extent to which people think that they communicate well, or just the extent to which people prefer different charts. So in this example, they took a load of real data from the real world and repackaged that data in a set of different sort of chart or data visualization treatments. You've got the most minimalist versions, which you can see an example of here on the left, where we've just got the actual data and the axis titles. Over on the right, you've got this sort of least minimalist, which is actually take the chart out altogether and just show, a bit like we saw in that previous study, a big block of text with the statistics written throughout it. And in between, we've got these sort of compromise points where you've got more text added along the way. This again, I think is just really important because it's a study that is going out to real people in the real world and saying which of these works better for you than others. So this isn't just someone coming up with their aesthetic preferences. This is experimental evidence. So again, we took real data. They took real data, multiple dozens and dozens of different examples, all presented, repackaged as these four different treatments to see which ones people preferred. And what were the results? Well, the least preferred chart out of all, and this was a pretty consistent finding in all the different line charts, bar charts, all the different treatments that were presented. The people's least favorite was this minimalist version, which strips back the text and gives you the quote unquote just show the data. That again, least favorite, because when I look at the next one, people would actually rather read this paragraph full of text and numbers than have that stripped back chart. And I think it's just worth pausing there for a second because that's a really interesting finding that I think goes against certainly some of the guidance that you would see out there in various data visualization learning resources and textbooks. Um, Humans like storytelling. We like to understand what's going on. We like to have a sense of what we're looking at, of the bigger picture, instead of being given something where we then have to do a lot of work ourselves to figure out what's going on. So that this idea that stripping everything back, minimalism, just show the data, that is, I'm sure, great for plenty of people. It's probably great for a lot of us on this call in this session who spend a lot of time looking at charts. But certainly for the average person, a consistent finding is that there is something about textual explanation, um, which helps. And so these were, that's not to get ahead of oneself. These were still the two least favorite treatments, but I think it's really striking that people actually preferred a paragraph to that really stripped back minimalist chart. So if we then go through to the charts that came second and first, in second place, so significantly more popular than the other two treatments already, was a chart which added a narrative title, by which I mean the title doesn't simply say what data the chart is showing. Um, it's giving you a little bit more. We've also got an annotation there telling us where the maximum point was. And so that, again, just adding a little bit more text, telling people what they're looking at, telling people what is going on, was already preferred to the previous ones. And then the winner was this one with additional annotations, again, telling people, here's what you're looking at. When you see this line spike upwards, that was because the president started some popular initiatives against child hunger. And when you see the steep decline, that was because there was then impeachment and a steady decrease in approval. So this, and again, this was just something conceptual, but you can see the storytelling mode already, the addition of text saying, here's what you're looking at here, here's how to understand what we're showing, adds really, really significant value. Um, so I think again, worth pausing, taking a step back, and thinking about what we're looking at here. The chart that was made in the leftmost example is exactly the same fundamentally as the chart was that was made in the one that ended up being ranked first place. The If you've gone through a data visualization textbook that's told you how to plot line charts, the how to plot line charts part would still only gets you to the fourth, the least preferred option, as it were. It's these additional steps to think about what are we trying to say here? How can we convey this? How can we bring someone who maybe doesn't look at charts all day along with us to understand what's going on? That is what significantly elevates this chart. So this is a point I'm going to come back to time and time again, is it's one thing to make a chart that is technically sound, but that is only the first step towards making something that is really, really effective at communicating with people. Again, a take home, a quote here from the paper: people preferred charts with the largest number of text annotations over charts with fewer annotations or text alone. So again, storytelling, the idea of explicitly focusing on the act of communication when making charts, is critically important. And I would say, I think, underrated in a lot of the resources out there that focus on the technical side. Um, there's then another paper that did, I think, perhaps even more intricate, even more impressive research on a very similar question. And that one is now goes all the way back to 2015. So a, a decade old, but still, I think, as relevant as it was when it was first written. So, in this piece of work, which was carried out at the University of Washington, the researchers took hundreds of real world graphics, so things that had been published in perhaps the news media or in textbooks or in government information, think tank reports, that kind of thing. So, real world visualizations, maps, charts, that sort of thing. And instead of just asking people to rank them this time, they did something that I think is even more, gets even closer to the fundamental questions we have here, which was they split this into three separate stages. First of all, to what extent is someone's eye drawn to a graphic, a visualization in the first place? Then would someone recognize that chart if it was quickly flashed on screen for them again a little later? And then third, how much do they then remember of what that chart was showing? So, does it get your attention in the first place? Would you recognize it again later? And then the most important one of all, can you remember what that chart showed? Really, the fundamental things that one would imagine that we're caring about or trying to optimize for when we're making a graphic, getting attention and conveying the information that was in that chart. So the way they did this, they first of all showed each chart to someone for about 10 seconds. Um, Another really interesting bit of this, which I'll come on to in a second, is they used eye tracking technology. So we're actually looking at where people's focus goes when they're looking at charts, maps, graphics as well, which I think is critical. Not just relying on what people said they remember, but actually seeing what their focus is going on. Second time around, these charts were blurred, and people were asked, do they remember that chart? And then the third time around, with that blurred image, it's can you remember what this chart was actually telling you? Um, and again, all real world charts. So none of this is just conceptual or illustrative. These were very real things. Um, and what I'm going to show you next is an example of some of the actual eye tracking that was done. So what we're going to look at is when someone first encounters a chart, where does their attention go when this is presented to them? And the next slide I'm going to show, which shows this eye tracking, is a animation. So it's going to loop, it's going to keep looping. So if you miss it first time, don't worry about it. But what we're looking at here is where do people's attention go when they look at the chart? So I'll let this loop a couple of times so we can see what's happening. When a chart is first put in front of someone's eyes, the attention goes to the title. Then it loops down and comes to look at what's on the axis. So essentially the actual units that they're looking at. and then it makes its way across the chart itself. So title first, drawn to text, then to the axis, which is telling us what the units are, and then to the actual content of the plot area. Going to let that loop again just while we talk about the significance of that. This is, I think, a very, very nice follow-on from that previous study in terms of the importance of text. When we're making charts, I think maybe I'm speaking too much for myself, but we focus an enormous amount on the actual plot, the colors, the shapes, the layout. And as I'll come on to in a few minutes, that is of course critically important. But we really should be aware when we're doing this that people's attention is nonetheless going to be drawn to a text first. And the text indeed is the most prominent thing that people tend to focus on. In this same study, the researchers asked people in stage 3 in the final bit, they asked people to write a text description of what they remembered about each chart. And when they tallied up what people mentioned when they talk about the charts that they'd seen earlier, there was a real emphasis again on the text. It was, well, I remember the title said this, I remember the annotation said this. Um, so when we use text in charts, I think it's just critically important. And if we're not using that, we're really missing an opportunity. But B, we should be aware that this is the stuff that people are going to remember. So if we don't use that, then we're only sort of using half or even less than half of the opportunity that's given to us when we actually make charts. So again, the conclusions from this piece of research, the title and other text should convey the message of a visualization. So this is not simply about saying GDP per capita over time, for example. It's what about GDP per capita over time? What was it in this time series that was significant? In addition, they found that using things like pictures, flags, sort of related imagery in a chart, counter to what some people have argued, that doesn't actually interfere with people's understanding. It doesn't tend to distract. It can actually help. People then have additional anchors, as it were, to remember a particular chart or what that chart was showing. And then the third step here, redundancy, helps to effectively communicate the message. So by redundancy here, we're talking about conveying the same thing multiple times. So instead of just showing the data, add those annotations which ram home that same message of what the data is showing. Or instead, for example, of just making one line in the line chart a particular color, instead of just making the most important line red, you could also make that line thicker. This idea that everything should be minimal and everything should be stripped back, I think we get a lot more nuance added to that. Of course, you still don't want a chart to be a complete mess of chart junk, but there is a lot that we can do beyond the most stripped back minimal aesthetic that will help people understand the chart, remember the chart, and be able to explain to someone else what that chart showed. And there's a lot there that we can add as well as simply removing things, which I think is, again, goes counter to some of the guidance that's currently out there. Sorry,
John,
I'll take a
apologies.
pause for a
Hi.
second. Yeah.
I'm just going to jump in with a few questions. Um, First of all, on this most recent slide, it seems like a few people didn't see the animation of the GIF, unfortunately. So I just wanted to confirm that it was title, axes, and then the chart. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, I'm just bringing that on screen again for a second. Maybe people are still seeing just a static version now.
Yeah, fortunately. Yeah.
Cool. So I'll just talk through. I think you can get a sense just from the position the blue dots are in there. But um, the in the full animation we have focus initially on the title that says top 10 most read books in the world. Then it comes across to the left to read the text on the y-axis, and it's only then that the eye moves across the columns in the chart there. So it's title, axis, contents.
Great. Thank you so much. And then real quick to go back to the previous section where you were talking about the different chart versions. Some of them had text and annotations, others didn't. And the best performing one was actually the one with the most annotations. And yeah, we just had a few questions or thoughts around people wondering if different groups prefer different designs depending on their individual learning style, because some people might be visual learners while some might prefer reading text. And then someone also said that they wonder what role education plays and if the logic would have the same results when published by mass media outlets or more niche publications, and just the kind of notion that audience matters. There were a few questions around those things. Don't know if you have any thoughts.
Cool. Yes. So I will just bring that back up. So, um, yes, I think first of all, this idea of who we're talking about here, I think is absolutely critical. But the really nice thing about this research and a lot of other research out there that I've certainly really appreciated is that these are not your classic study which just says we talk to a bunch of grad students. These are often these are generally talking to quite diverse groups of people in terms of education level, occupation, age, all of these things, and the findings are very, very consistent. So there's another paper which I don't actually have in this talk, but this was by a researcher called Evan Peck, and in that paper, he and his co-authors worked specifically with people of lower education who lived in rural America, and did very similar exercise, asking people to rank charts. And again, a consistent finding. If anything, it was more consistent. The lower the education levels was the importance of text. And that may be what the person who was asking this was expecting, because you can imagine that people of higher education have had more experience looking at charts in general, so they maybe need less sort of written hand-holding, as it were. But across all education levels, we see this preference for significant amounts of annotation, and certainly for narrative titles rather than just the titles just stressing units. Um, so yeah, that was true in terms of education levels. In terms of things like learning styles, I haven't seen that broken out in any of these studies. But again, I think it's notable that in the study I've got on screen right now, it was a completely consistent finding that the chart that had the least text on was ranked lowest by virtually everyone. And again, I can a brief digression there to say why I think that's the case. Um, is the fact that from the age of about 4 or earlier in some cases, we're all being taught to recognize letters and words, right? We have this second nature understanding that when we see these shapes, they are words. They convey information. We don't even have to think about that. The information is just there. Um, Sadly for me, we're not taught to intuitively read line charts from the age of 4. Although maybe I'll make an exception for my son. But yeah, so I think there's just a pretty basic thing here, which is that one of these things we've had decades of learning on, the other we haven't. One we've had vast amounts of exposure on and are exposed to it every day, the other we're not. So I'm sure there are some subtle differences here between what people of different education, different learning styles would find best, but the addition of text beyond 0 seems to be a very, very consistent preference across people of all sorts of backgrounds.
Great. Thank you so much. And last one on that, apologies, it came up a few times, um, is whether it would differ if it's like in a printed format to if it's in a presentation like you're doing now. Um, would the one with more annotation still be preferred in the presentation context?
Well, we should do a poll at the end.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I think there's definitely a difference there, but I don't know if the difference is necessarily the print versus presentation so much as time, but the amount of time that someone has with that. And the two are often related, right? So when someone is reading something in print, they often have more time. They are probably sat somewhere. They've got a piece of paper in front of them. It's not sort of whizzing past them in a social media feed or in a slide deck, for example. And that's why I think you have these amazingly large and detailed and intricate sort of coffee table style infographics, I think can work really well in a big print setting, or you can imagine them even in an art gallery or something, which is the ultimate situation where people have time. Whereas throw that same thing on social media or into a sort of crowded media environment full of distractions, and that would be less the case. So I certainly think the more time you imagine your viewer, reader, whatever we want to call it, is going to have with your piece of work, the more detail and intricacy you can add. Certainly, you can add more and more annotations. Um, but even I think in the most distracted and crowded setting, you should, you still want that chart to be visually compelling to get someone's attention. But once you've got their attention, certainly I think there's still scope there to add a couple of annotations. Now, the how many annotations is too many annotations. As it happens, is actually one of the sections I'm going to touch on in next week's session. But again, I think without going too much into the details here, the very, very, very consistent finding from all sorts of bits of research that have been done on this is that um, narrative title and labels and annotations, certainly going from zero to some of those is a massive, massive value add.
Awesome. Thank you.
Cool. So that's a lot on text. But as I say, it's not just about text. If it were, we would simply write those paragraph versions. So color and layout and design are also massively important here. So this next little section is about specifically color. And for this section, I owe a debt of gratitude to Colin Ware and his book, Visual Thinking for Design, which is a classic. It's now, I think, a couple of decades old, but takes this really sort of zoomed out view of how the brain works when we look at things. So way broader than just charts, but there's a lot in here for us to learn from as data visualization practitioners. And the key concept that he identifies and talks about is the idea of certain visual properties, which are what we could call pre-attentive or pop out, which is to say there are certain visual phenomena which our attention will be drawn to without even having to think about it, without even being asked to look at something. And the way Colin Ware introduces this in the book is it really goes back to evolution. It was the the fundamental essential need for us to be able to spot something that doesn't look like the stuff around it. For example, a lion leaping out of the grass. Or to spot something that is much bigger or much smaller than something else, or there's a different angle to something else, something that doesn't fit with what's around it. It was from an evolutionary perspective, it's quite important to be able to spot that. Even you can even imagine spotting the rotten fruit among the fruit that are not rotten. But yeah, it's about this concept of things that our attention is drawn to without even having to think about it, and how can designers in any space, such as data visualization, leverage that. So there are a few different channels through which this works, and by channels I mean things like movement, something that moves when everything around it is still. That's one of the ways that you can direct attention. Um, Another way that you can direct attention is shape or size. So something that is bigger or smaller than the things around it can direct attention. Color is another one, of course, something's a different color. Um, but those have, I think, different suitability, and some are more and less effective than others when we're talking about charts and data visualization. So to give you a practical example of that, I'm going to show you on the next slide a bunch of circles or of dots, and one of these is the odd one out. And I'm going to ask if you can see which one it is, and I'm sure for most, if not all of you, after a couple of seconds, if that, you probably spotted which one was the odd one out. It was this one in the lower right, which is slightly larger than the others. But I think I'm probably correct in thinking that it was like it maybe took a second. It was you were being asked a question, which is the biggest, and then you had a quick look and you figured out which was the biggest. Whereas when I show you this version, I the process there is quicker. I'm not even having to say, look out for which one of these is a different color to the others. The eye is immediately drawn to this very, very strong color contrast. Um, so, and you can imagine the same thing with a line chart. I talked about the idea earlier of having, if you're wanting to draw attention to one line in a chart, you could do it in a different color. You could also make it slightly thicker. I think you can imagine as well, and I'll show you an example in a second, that the strong color contrast is going to do more directing of attention than having a line slightly thicker than the others. If the line is 10 times thicker, then sure, maybe that draws more attention. But color contrast is this really, really powerful tool that we can use when we're making charts to direct people's attention to the key parts without them having to do too much of that sort of cognitive work themselves. Um, but when we're talking about color, there is a catch. It's not as simple as color good, or bright colors good. And so to give you a little sort of stripped back minimal example of that, um, if you can imagine you've got some data in a spreadsheet, you throw that into your charting tool of choice. Chances are the result you're going to get is going to look something like the upper chart here. There's going to be some lovely reds, some blues, some yellows, some greens, beautiful colors, striking colors. But where's my attention meant to go? Whereas if the point of the chart that you're making is to emphasize one series over the others, which in many, if not most cases, if there was a need to make a chart at all, there's probably a central point to that chart. You'd be much better served doing that by using that leveraging color contrast to direct people's attention without even having to think about it. So color is this amazingly powerful tool that we have, but you need to use it in the knowledge that the key is color contrast rather than just color full stop. To give you another example of that in action, if I show you these circles again and say, right, identify the dark green circle, it takes that little bit longer than when I showed this example. In this example, the contrast all points you in one direction. In this example, there's much less contrast. There's a lot of other things going on here which can distract. Similarly, if I asked you in this next one to look for the red circle, well, there are now lots of red circles. Some of them are more pale than the others. Again, we're making it slightly more difficult for someone to naturally focus on the focal point. So the overarching principles when it comes to using color in data visualization are to minimize distraction. So if a data point or data points need to be shown in your chart for context, but are not critical to what that chart, to the key insight that that chart is delivering, then it's unhelpful. It's actively unhelpful to have them all in bright colors because that's just going to distract people from where the key part of that chart is. So minimize distraction and maximize contrast. So maximizing contrast means as well, we've got to think about things like background colors. If you've got a white background to your chart, which is usually the case, then a nice bright red will stand out very strongly against that background. If you've got a black background, red is actually much less contrasting to that background, and you might want a much brighter yellow or a pale blue. Of course, white will give you the highest contrast. So when we're using color, think about contrast. Similarly, if there are two really important lines that you want to show on your chart, if one of them's red, maybe make the other one blue. Look for something that significantly contrasts in color from not only the background, but from that primary line. So again, color is amazingly powerful, but we've got to think about how we're using it. So the overarching, or actually, sorry, I'll pause there for a second, Louisa. I don't know if there are any questions on the color section before I go into the next bit.
I think we are all good.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Okay, well, the overarching message then that comes from the evidence we've seen there, from Colin Ware on color and from the various academic papers, including other ones that I didn't include, is that we should be thinking here about charts fundamentally as about communication. When we're making a chart, we are not just doing a sort of mathematical task or a design task. We're trying to communicate something to someone. And I think we should have that thought at the front of our minds as we're doing that. One thing that I've realized over the years that I find myself naturally doing whenever I start making a chart is I sort of have this Z shape um, concept in my head, which is I'm thinking, right, where is someone's attention going to move as they encounter this chart? They're going to start on the title, they're then going to move down, and they're then going to come across the actual plot area. So when I'm making that chart, I'm putting a lot of effort and time into getting that title right. Um, and I'm putting a lot of effort as well into anything that I can do in terms of the design to naturally guide someone's attention through that chart. Maybe that's left to right, maybe it's top to bottom, and so on. But these things are just, I think, seem very minor. They seem like just the last 2% of making a chart. But I think the research pretty consistently shows that in terms of the impact this has on how a chart will be remembered, understood, and by whom, these are actually the most important things. And an example I always remember was from the COVID pandemic when this was the most important story in the world. And so there were people out there, loads and loads of people out there with questions that charts were amazingly well placed to answer. And I'll always remember an old school friend who I'd not spoken to in about 15 years getting in touch with me on WhatsApp and saying that her mum, who she described as very much not a chart person, had just texted her one of our charts from the FT and was talking about it. And that struck me as really significant because I don't think that would have happened with a really stripped back chart that just had the line and the axes. That was happening because by adding text and annotations, we were really broadening out the audience of people who could see these charts as being for them. And I often think about this as we sort of have chart people and non-chart people out there. You've got weirdos like me who spend unhealthy amounts of time making charts, looking at charts, and for whom charts are the most natural thing to see ever. But there are millions and millions and millions of people out there for whom that is not true. And by adding clear text, annotations, labels to charts, we're allowing these people to feel that charts are for them as well. So it's all about thinking about charts as communication. And then in terms of broad principles, the important thing here is I'm not saying just keep adding more and more stuff to the chart. We do still want to remove clutter. We want to remove things from a chart that are not aiding us in that communication task. But the equally important thing is to add clarity. And sometimes adding clarity will mean removing things, but sometimes it will mean adding things. It will mean adding that narrative title. It will mean adding annotations, adding labels. Um, so when we're next making charts, um, I think it's useful to remind ourselves that the task on the left, this technical, precision, objective mathematical task, while that's important for us as the people making charts, that's not how that chart is going to be consumed. All of the research, all of the experimental stuff from the real world shows that when someone is looking at a chart, what's happening is actually much closer to the right. People are sitting back and looking for the overarching message, the story that is coming out of that chart. People are not generally looking in very, very fine detail through a magnifying glass, trying to work out whether that line on your chart is at 4.81 or 4.82. So once we've got the fundamental geometry of the chart sorted, we should really be focusing on this storytelling task that is actually what is actually a much neater analog or analogy for how people consume charts. So 100% for those of you on this call who love the maths and the art of all of this, great chart making absolutely does still include the maths and the art. But to make sure we're doing our job as communicators as well as possible, we need to be thinking about this as storytelling. So with about 10 minutes left, I'm going to use some of those just to go through a case study, a walkthrough of putting these principles into action. And the case study I'm going to use is one that I referenced earlier, or I'm just going to pause a second, Louisa. Maybe we have some questions before that.
Yeah, sorry. Just to cover off a few questions before we go into the case study, if that's okay. We had a few questions around the use of color. So I thought I would just jump in um, around your thoughts on using various shades of the same color. I'm just going to bundle a few questions here. Um, the complexity or multiple colors in graphics that are less designed to convey a single simple point, but are meant to be sumptuous visually. Um, Sorry, I'm not quite sure if I understand that one. I suppose it's around like using many different colors. Um, and then also if whether you know if there's any data around the use of shape versus color in terms of providing contrast.
Cool. Yes. So, um, sorry, just a second. Lost myself on my screen. Yeah, I think I'll just shape on shape. Shape is can absolutely be helpful again, but it's and again, unless the differences in the shape being shown are really, really, really dramatic, that is another one where color is that bit more effective. The just the way our eyes work, color contrast is just significantly better than shape contrast, space contrast, that kind of thing. Where shape is most effective is if you can imagine a grid where you've got, say, 20 by 20 little objects, and um, all 399, 399 out of the 400 are circles, and one of them is a star. You can imagine that star is going to pop out, but it relies on the background being very densely filled with other shapes. If you've got, you can imagine 10 shapes that are more widely spread apart, and nine of them are circles and one is a star, the star is going to stand out less. You're going to have to do more actual thinking, looking, exploring, more time, more effort to see that that thing is different. Whereas a sharp color contrast, we really seem to be able to get much more subliminally without even looking in detail. Um, in terms of the other questions, using different shades of the same color, 100%. So it sounds almost like we planted these questions, but that is going to be another thing that I come onto in the case studies in next week's session. Using color to group things together, so having different shades of red for a related thing and different shades of blue for another related thing, is a classic way that we should be using color, and I will go through some case studies of exactly that. And we also had the question there about just whether sometimes the point of a graphic is to be beautiful and to have all these sumptuous shades of color. Now, I'm not going to say that that's not true. I'm sure there are many cases where it is true, but honestly, the most powerful conversation I've ever had in my career, which is a strong statement to make, but I 100% believe it, was about 10 years ago when a good friend of mine one day said to me, "Oh, I love that chart you made the other day. It was really cool. I have no idea what it meant." And that sort of broke my brain. I thought, wait, how can you love a chart without actually understanding it? And that's when I realized that when you make things that are just really good looking, really, this one had like beautiful color gradient going from reds through yellows and that kind of thing. If someone doesn't have an intuitive grasp of data visualization, if someone is not used to looking at charts and trying to get information from them, then they're going to look at that and think, "Oh, that's really cool, nice, like love the colors," and they're not going to come away from the information at all. It's actually almost distracting. So, um, again, this is not to say that one shouldn't focus on beauty when making data visualization, but I think it's probably the case that the more sumptuous the design of a graphic, the more risk there is that someone is focusing on that sumptuousness and not on the information that is conveyed within it. The beauty almost becomes a distraction. So, yep, I'm sure there will be cases where you want that red and the blue and the pink and the orange and all of those in there. But I think it's just about being really, really aware that we are making a trade-off when we do that. So yeah, hopefully that answers those questions and I can move on to the final section.
Great. Thank you so much. There are many more questions coming through. We'll try and take some at the end. I'd love to hand back to you for the case study, and then we'll see if we have a bit more time towards the end.
Wonderful, thank you. So yeah, putting it together, I'm going back to the first chart that we made at the FT, really showing the takeoff of COVID in the pandemic, and how we would go from the first draft of that chart to the final version, and using all the principles that I've been talking about so far. So this story all began with this email that I received in the first week of March 2020. This was when we had been hearing wall to wall on the news about what had been happening first in East Asia, but then Italy, northern Italy, we were starting to hear and indeed see very alarming things. But at this stage, there was still a huge amount of uncertainty. There were explanations being offered for why this might have been happening elsewhere, but was not going to continue coming further west. So this big question that everyone had at the beginning of March was, what does the situation look like in other countries compared to these awful things we're hearing from a place like Italy? And so the very first rough version of the chart that I made off the back of that email, using ggplot in R, for those who are familiar, looked a bit like this. We've got an x-axis showing the number of days since a country had its 100th COVID case, confirmed case. The y-axis, which isn't even labeled here, but I can tell you, was the total number of cases that had accumulated since that point. and you've got the various countries' lines shown on this chart. Now, the point I want to make here is that in terms of just the fundamentals of, right, we've got an x-axis, a y-axis, some lines, the data's all there. This chart technically does answer that question that was posed by my colleague in the email, but this is not something that I think would have um, really resonated with millions of people and um, prompted the entire 2 year long focus that we at the FT then had on this story and particularly through visualizing it. So I want to go through the steps between this chart and the one that we ended up publishing. So if I were to use a tool like Flourish, the equivalent is something like this. I've thrown that data in. This is now a chart, which again, technically, geometrically, layout, it's all there. We've got two axes, we've got data points, we've got different colors for different lines, we've got a legend up there. The fundamentals have been hit there. But again, I think this is totally incomplete. And whenever we make a chart which looks like this, it's technically sound, but what's my story? What am I meant to conclude from this? Um, we should consider that we've only really begun working on this chart rather than finishing it. So if I go through step by step, the first thing we might want to do is add that narrative title. So we've now got something which directly answered the question that everyone would have come to this chart with, which was we've heard about what's going on in a country like Italy or in some parts of Asia. What's going on where I am? The title is now answering that, telling us that most of these countries, as you can see, are actually on the same trajectory, whereas some others have managed to slow the spread. But again, that's the text, but the color, we're not using color well here. We need to do more to allow people to focus on the most important points. Um, well, first of all, sorry, we've got the legend. So the issue you have with a chart like this is you're asking someone to keep checking back and forth between the legend and the lines, the legend and the lines. What's this color? What's this color? What's this country? That is, again, we're not making it easy for someone to see what's going on in this chart. So we can move those labels from the legends to the lines. Now people can at least see what they're meant to be looking at. People can look at Italy there where things have got particularly bad, and people can then look down and see the UK, the US, Spain, France, Germany heading on alarmingly similar trajectories. So we're adding text, we're then moving text closer to the data so that this becomes something that more people can understand. You can almost think about it as broadening out the audience. So you've gone from something very sterile here, which only other people who were making charts of COVID data every day would have understood naturally, through to this. Then we're leveraging what I just said about color. We can start using color to group things. Let's have the East Asian countries here in blue. We've got Italy as the most alarming case in a shade of black, UK and US in other countries that stand out, and then secondary countries we've got in a grey. So again, we're just with each time we're making the matching between the data visualization and the message, the information, closer and closer and closer, so that this fits together and that there is less and less head scratching required for someone who encounters this chart. And then the final step, we can go and add some more useful annotations. We can add a line there saying, here's what things would look like if case numbers were doubling every 2 days. We can add some annotations explaining what was believed to have been helping with the reduction of the spread in these different countries. So we've taken something, again, the fundamental geometry of this chart, the units on the x-axis, the y-axis, the choice to use a line chart in the first place, none of that has changed. But we've significantly improved this chart as a piece of communication by focusing on text, color, labels, annotations, that kind of thing. So just to show that contrast there, the success of this data visualization is markedly different from this version on the left to the version on the right. Again, there's nothing technically incorrect with the version on the left, but it is lacking all of that additional text-based elevation or expansion, which turns it into something that can suddenly speak to a much, much larger audience. So to wrap up, as I know we're hitting the end of our time, the takeaway I'd love people to go away from here is that data visualization, despite those two words, not including the following words, is actually really about communication, storytelling, and words. So next time I make a chart, and hopefully next time you make a chart, think about not just making charts for chart people, but making stories for all people. Have that image in your mind when you're starting making that chart of there is an audience out there, there are people out there, and you want your chart to A, make sense, communicate, cut through to as many of them as possible, ideally all of them. And B, that one of the ways that probably the most powerful way you can do that is use things like text to make that the message from that chart explicit instead of asking people to invest the time and effort in trying to work out what that chart is showing.